If you were to analyze your average D&D group and what they spend their game time doing, I'm willing to bet you that you would find the majority of groups spend most of their time in combat encounters. So if you're playing a game that lasts for 4 hours, you might spend 2 hours or more just duking things out with the bad guys. Now, yes, of course, there are exceptions to this because I recognize that many gaming groups enjoy social interactions more than combat. However, despite the fact that we spend so much time in combat in Dungeons & Dragons often feels rather flat. It gets old, stale, and boring. What was once exciting becomes mundane. And you know, this might be part of the reason that there are so many groups that disdain combat and prefer to solely engage in social interactions, which they erroneously refer to as role-playing, not acknowledging that the entire game is role-playing. But we're not gonna get into that rant today. We're just gonna move on. So the question then becomes, why is combat in Dungeons & Dragons sometimes so boring? And I think it has to do with how it's implemented by game masters and to some extent by players. I think that the bones for amazing combat is in the game system, but we sometimes don't effectively pull it all together in a way that would deliver enthralling combats time and time again. You see, many times our combats simply consist of characters and monsters standing around and swinging their weapons at each other, and perhaps casting some spells, assuming they don't just get counter-spelled, of course. And there are occasionally some special abilities, but many times combat just comes down to standing in one place and swinging your weapon, which at the game table equates to rolling dice and doing math. And if combat can be boiled down to rolling dice and doing math, then that is probably at the heart of why it can be so boring. Hi, I'm Lucar, and on this channel I share my nearly 30 years of game master experience so that you can run amazing games that your players will love. And today we're talking about how we can make D&D combat actually good. How can you as a game master improve the combat in your games? Now, please note that we're going to specifically talk about combat encounters, which is why I've been saying combat so much in this video thus far. But there's going to be the inevitable person who's going to go on a rant about how not every encounter is combat. And yes, you are right. In fact, I've gone on that very same rant myself at least a few times. So we are not going to address how the encounter starts, or who attacks first, or whether the players have any choice or agency in the encounter resulting in combat. Today, we are going to assume that through one mechanism or another, combat has resulted. Number 1, creatures. The very first thing that makes up a combat is the creatures that the characters are fighting. And there are a handful of things that you want to keep in mind here. First, more is better than few or just one. One single creature, even if it is a powerful one, is rarely an interesting or memorable fight unless they have some way to avoid the standard surround and pound whereby everybody just gathers around the creature and beats it down into oblivion. Now, I will say on a somewhat related tangent, it's also important to note that the opposite can be a problem. A solo monster or even a group of monsters that fly out of reach and that the characters can't hit or attack can also lead to frustration and boredom. But our guiding rule here is that variety is the spice of life, and this applies in a few different ways. First, a weaker boss monster with minions generally presents a more interesting challenge for characters than a solo boss monster, even if they have legendary actions. Right now, I'm in the process of writing my Escape from the Fae Adventure module, and when we design monsters, some of them are designed as solo boss fights. However, we have to be particularly careful to design those monsters such that a solo fight will be interesting for players. And it is not an easy task, which is why we often avoid these solo boss fights. Usually I have a boss monster with a handful of minions because I know that that is going to result in a more interesting fight for everyone at the game table with less effort. Introducing variety among the minions takes this a step farther. You might have a hobgoblin boss with goblin followers, and those goblins have a mix of short bows, swords, and spells that they're flinging at the characters. But even better than that, you might have a hobgoblin with a winter wolf ally and then a few goblin sidekicks. Now the equation has become far more interesting. The hobgoblin is swinging his massive two-handed sword. The winter wolf is breathing ice and pain down upon the characters, and the goblins are shooting arrows and flinging firebolts. This gives the players a puzzle to solve. It introduces the idea of tactics. It presents to them a challenge that must be overcome, and one that involves more than just standing in one spot and attacking the same enemy over and over again. You have a dynamic situation with a variety of different challenges and problems to be overcome. And by the way, these are some of the very same reasons that one solo boss all by himself is rarely interesting, because it doesn't have all those elements. Or even if it technically does, in actual practice at the game table, they're not able to be implemented effectively. Also note that variety doesn't need to be mechanical. You can use the exact same stat block and just vary the descriptions. Nobody cares if the 1d6 damage that the goblin is inflicting is from a sword, a hand axe, an arrow, a firebolt, or from a handful of splinters that they fling into a character's eyes. You can literally just use the same stat block and just change your descriptions of things. It's the variety in how those attacks are described and the variation itself that makes for more interesting foes and combat. The TLDR here is that same is boring and variety is interesting. Next, your enemies need motivation. Why are they at that location to begin with? Is it their home? Creatures are much more likely to fight to the death if they're defending their home. Or are the creatures looking for something? What is it and why do they want it? If a creature was sent there by their boss in search of a special object and they are facing consequences for failure, they're likely to fight harder. However, if they're just there looking to put some money in their pockets as mercenaries, they're much more likely to break and run. And why are the creatures fighting instead of talking? Perhaps they did talk first and that failed, so things escalated to aggressive negotiations. But if that wasn't the case, you have to ask yourself, are the creatures territorial? Were they ordered to kill or capture the characters? Are they hungry or driven by a survival instinct? You see, all of this helps craft more interesting enemies, which leads to more interesting fights. And it also gives you the information you need as the game master to role play the creatures more effectively, both in and outside of combat. Now let's talk about tactics. The tactics you have your bad guys use in combat should fit their intelligence, their instincts, and their capabilities. Smart enemies should use the environment, seek to exploit the weaknesses of the characters, and so forth. These are the very same things that your players' characters, who are usually fairly intelligent, use against the monsters, so it makes complete sense that intelligent enemies would do the same. Now, tactics should vary from one encounter to another. The same thing over and over again is going to be boring or possibly frustrating. I know that players tend to use the same things over and over again because they are very effective. Hypnotic Pattern, Spirit Guardians, Fireball, and all the other very powerful options, or one might argue overpowered options that they have at their disposal. However, if you as a dungeon master do that as well and simply start spamming all of the most powerful spells and abilities in the game, that's gonna get fairly boring for both you and your players, I would wager. And remember, tactics don't just include maneuvering around the battlefield. They include which enemy to attack, which spells to cast, whether to shove someone to the ground and grapple them or to just attack them with your sword. Do you attempt to disrupt the concentration of the spellcaster, or do you just cast Dispel Magic instead? Should you take cover around the corner? Doing things that the players don't expect but still make sense for the enemies involved can make for a really interesting surprises. For instance, using a rarely used spell or unique ability that the players have never seen before can make for a lot of fun. Do note though that the tactics you design for your enemies in a combat encounter should be something that the characters can reasonably counter given some thought and time. I once designed a Rakshasa monk that had crazy insane mobility. It could travel about 90 feet in a round with just its movement. It had the equivalent of a flyby attack, and I'm pretty sure that I even gave it a teleport ability. Now, I'm gonna tell you my players were hard pressed to pin that monk down and do anything to him. And because Rakshasas are very resistant to spells, that boss fight was a beast. They eventually kind of figured it out, but even then, the particular tactics I designed for this monk were almost uncounterable. I think I overtuned that encounter just a little bit. I mean, we still had fun with it, but it was rough. The next thing to consider is giving your monsters a sense of individuality. Variety can be as simple as kobolds of 5 different colors, a mix of female and female ogres, or soldiers with different kinds of armor and weapons. And much like varying the weapons that a creature has makes them unique, so do special traits, mannerisms, and motivations. A battle with 3 goblins is going to be way more interesting if one goblin constantly giggles the entire combat, Another goblin is a complete coward who is just waiting for the chance to run. And the third goblin is trying to get the coward killed because he is untrustworthy and wants to get the giggler killed because he's absolutely annoying. You see, a combat like that will be far more dynamic and entertaining than just 3 goblins that attack. Also, don't forget to consider morale in your combats. Unless they don't value their own lives, creatures need a real motivating reason to fight to the death. Shoot, I would submit that most creatures would need a motivating reason to get into a fight at all, considering that in D&D combat, the most likely result is disfigurement, being maimed, or death. At any rate, creatures that run create tension because the players don't know what that creature is going to do if it gets away. Right now, I'm running Escape from the Fae for my patron players, and they were just in a combat with a few Emberkin. And toward the end of combat, 2 of the Emberkin broke ranks and began to flee toward the orchard where there were dozens more Emberkin. And my players scrambled to stop them using all manner of tactics and persuasion to do so. However, one of the Emberkin did get away, and it alerted the rest of its brethren, resulting in a massive search party for the characters. Creatures that surrender create an equally interesting situation. Now you have a moral and or logistical quandary. After the characters question the prisoner, what do they do with him? Do they kill him in cold blood? Do they tie him up and leave him stashed away somewhere, risking that he might escape and alert his companions? Now, what I suggest you do to prepare for your combat encounters is prior to a game session, creating a short bullet list of encounter notes. These should include tactics the creatures might use, whether they might run away or if they fight to the death, and if they're captured, what information they might reveal to the characters when put to the question. In fact, this is the exact thing that we at the DM Lair do in all of the adventures we publish. For example, here you can see adventures from Lair magazine, and in every single area where there is potential for a combat encounter, we include a bullet list of encounter notes. These are designed to guide the game master when running the encounter. By the way, if you're a new game master who's perhaps not sure where to even start when designing an adventure for your game, or if you're a veteran who is strapped for time and looking for pre-made content, the adventures and other 5th edition resources that we publish in Lair magazine might be exactly what you need. Every monthly issue contains professionally designed adventures and other drag and drop resources such as traps, puzzles, and monsters. You will also get the digital map files so that you can import them into the virtual tabletop of your choice. And if you use Foundry VTT, you can also pick up our Foundry packs, which contain our adventures and monsters 100% ready to play. We also have a Pathfinder 2 version of Lair magazine. I will drop links below just in case you're interested. Number 2, terrain and the map. Now, monster mechanics are important to making the combat unique, but one might argue that a memorable setting is more important than complex mechanics. And this is where the map and terrain you use contribute to the enjoyability of your combat. Just as much with creatures, variety is important with terrain, and here are some of the key elements to consider for making maps and terrain that will lend themselves to interesting combats. Levels. Consider having there be high ground and low ground and ways to traverse from one to the other. These levels should complicate the fight to a certain degree and help inform tactics on both sides. Choke points. Movement is important on any battlefield, and having choke points allows the enemies and the players to try to gain an advantage by restricting their foe's movement. Also, you want to scatter different elements across the map that will provide both cover and obstacles throughout the area. These might be tables and chairs or bookcases, they might be tree trunks or undergrowth or fallen logs, rivers or cliffs or boulders. Next, consider adding hazards to your combat map. You might have terrain that shifts and changes throughout the course of the combat, or terrain that is dangerous and can damage both characters and enemies alike. Or you might have places where movement is restricted, or care must be taken to avoid damage or danger, such as narrow walkways over a ravine. There might also be traps that the enemies have set for invaders, or perhaps even traps that not even the enemies are aware of and they themselves might fall victims to. And by the way, all of these maps that you've been seeing on screen are from Lair magazine. We do our very best in our publications to use professionally designed maps that are going to make a dungeon master's life as easy as possible by incorporating these elements. elements. One of the most important things that you're looking for when you design maps this way is that you're seeking to have an evolving battlefield. You see, no matter how interesting and complex a battlefield is, if the characters and enemies all go to one spot and fight right there without ever moving or utilizing the different elements on the combat map, the battlefield may as well be just that one location on a naked, featureless grid. Thus, the battlefield, the combat map, and enemy tactics should encourage movement and the utilization of the different elements that are on the combat field. Furthermore, you might have the battlefield itself change throughout the combat. You might have ice floating on a river, or a ship in choppy water, or a volcanic cave with a floor that is shifting between open and closed cracks. By the way, if you're finding this information useful, please give me a thumbs up and share this video with a fellow game master. And if you're not already subscribed to my channel, why not subscribe while you're at it? Number 3, time. You're probably familiar with the importance of tracking time in your game at a high level of days and weeks and months. You probably also know that you can use time pressure to influence elements at that same high level. The evil bad guy might complete the horrible ritual in a week's time, putting pressure on the characters to get stuff done. However, you can also use time pressure in your combats. Having combats with deadlines increases drama. Perhaps patrols come by at regular times, and taking too long in any particular fight might result in reinforcements. There might be a time hazard that is counting down to a massive explosion. Or you might have an NPC who is bleeding out and the characters need to get to him before it's too late. Here are a couple different types of timed elements you can use in your games. You can have combat stages, where the combat changes after a specific interval of time. For instance, waves of enemies might arrive on certain rounds. That is a trick I use myself with some frequency, I might add. Or the boss monster might appear for one round and then he's gone for the next 3 while his minions beat on the characters. Or a boss monster is constantly transforming, and every 2 rounds their stat block changes to something different. I have a player who hates boss monster transformations. I think he sees them as like a gimmick or something. But I don't know. I like it. I think it's cool. You can also have timed hazards or benefits that are active during a combat while the characters are fighting the enemies. Razored pendulums swing across the hallway every 3 rounds, affecting random spaces. A geyser of magma might explode every 4 rounds. There might be a healing burst that radiates from an artifact of power, restoring hit points to everyone in a certain radius. And this happens every 3 rounds, benefiting both enemies and characters alike. Or the walls might be closing in, and the room will completely disappear in 6 rounds if the characters aren't through the door on the other side by then. And if they don't make it, they won't have another chance to do so for another 100 years. You can also implement special in-game conditions during a combat. This is something aside from victory for one side or another that would end the battle. For instance, an overwhelming force might be about to arrive, and the characters only have 3 rounds to defeat their enemies or escape. The heroes might have to prevent a bomb from detonating on round 4. Or the boss monster might ascend to godhood if not defeated in under 1 minute. 10 rounds. Number 4, dynamic elements. Here are some other dynamic elements that you can include in your combats. First, lair actions. These do not have to be reserved only for legendary monsters or even for D&D 5th edition. They can technically be added to any monster you'd like. Next, weather and atmosphere. You can use this to create complications during combat. Rain obscures vision slightly and makes terrain slippery. Dark environments, especially those that impede or weaken dark vision, can create issues with visibility and footing. Other dangers like lighting could be random and damage both characters and monsters alike. Extreme temperatures might exhaust or damage characters unless they take certain actions or precautions. Wind, just as much as difficult terrain, can change how the characters move. You can also place secondary objectives in your combat. The characters might have to protect an NPC or object. They might need to retrieve an item or rescue an NPC in the middle of combat. They might need to avoid notice or attempt to draw out a smaller group of enemies from a room rather than fight everyone all at once. The characters might need to escape overwhelming odds, a cave-in, rising waters, or other elements that make the characters need to get out of their current location. Now, twists in the middle of combat can also make things amazing. On round 3, the characters somehow discovered that killing the boss or minion minions has a major consequence, making non-lethal combat necessary. A third party arrives to the combat and they oppose both sides. Now you have a three-way combat. A sudden warning of more approaching enemies rings across the battlefield, increasing the stress of the situation and immediately adding a ticking clock to the combat. There might be sudden darkness or blinding light that changes the visibility conditions. You could have a sudden change to the terrain, such as the floor dropping away in places, a ship splitting in half, or an avalanche filling part of the room. Number 5, purpose and reward. Combat for the sake of combat is something that probably very few groups are going to find enjoyable. Instead, players usually like to know that there is a reason, a purpose for the combat. It might be something as simple as an ogre guard blocking the way forward, or the need to eradicate a group of goblins to stop them from attacking caravans. It doesn't have to be terribly complex, but there needs to be a story reason attached to a combat. If gnolls charge over a hill to attack the characters as they travel, it should be because the characters are trespassing on the gnolls' sacred burial ground, not because the game master decided that they just needed a random encounter at that point in the game. Related to this, there should also be a reward for every combat encounter. Now, this doesn't always have to be a monetary reward, such as coins or gems or magic items. It could be something satisfying like getting revenge on the imp that has been mocking your character for the last 3 hours, but always keeping just out of range or around a corner. Whatever it is, your players should feel a sense of satisfaction and accomplishment after they defeat a group of bad guys. Now, I've compiled a checklist of all the things you should consider when creating encounters, both from this video and all my others, and placed it on the DM Lair store just in case you're interested. This will serve as a handy guide for designing your encounters. I also have an entire encounter creation playlist filled with more videos to help you create awesome encounters for your games that you can watch at the link down below or right up here. Anyway, that's just what I think. Let me know what you think down in the comments. What do you do when creating encounters for your D&D groups? Now, if you'd like to learn how to make combat more exciting with tactical actions, watch this video right here. And until next time, happy game mastering.